Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We're now going to talk about Everett Rogers Chapter 7, Innovativeness and Adopter Categories. The point of this is to understand how the adoption, that Christensen was talking about, as we go up the curve, he's actually describing an S curve, which is kind of a normal distribution of adoption, how that is influenced by the individuals who are adopting along the way. So we talked a little bit about this in the last lecture on, I can't see, page 247 of chapter 7. You see the bell curve. And this takes us through the different categories of adopters and the percentage of adoption that's taking place. And what you find, and we'll go through this a little more detail. Innovators are the first 2.5% of adoption. Early adopters are the next 13.5% of adoption. At that point, you're starting to see the steep uphill climb of diffusion. Early adopters influence the early majority. That's the next 34% of adoption. So as we get to the top of early majority, we've got 50% of the population of people that are going to adopt this innovation, they have adopted. The early majority, that significantly influences observability, which we talked about in the last chapter. Now you're starting to see, electric cars or, digital cameras all over the place. 50% of the population has one. So everywhere you look, you're seeing an EV. The late majority then starts adopting, and the reason is because as this adoption, as this innovation is diffusing, rather, this adoption is influencing the purchasing of the old product, the mainstream product. So as people are adopting this new innovation, they are not buying the old innovation. And so it is becoming more expensive, harder to find, things like that. So it's becoming like, okay, I've kind of got to go to this because it's hard to get the other one. As the late majority starts to adopt, if you're looking at a traditional S curve, which is what you saw in the Christensen video, he's showing you that curve as we get from the the rebar in the U.S. Steel example all the way up to what was it? Sheets of steel, I think it was called. I can't remember what it was called, but it's the very top of the line when you're talking about, steel manufacturing. You're starting to level off because you're getting to the point where there isn't anyone else to come on and purchase. You've basically taken over the entire market. That's when the laggards get on. So laggards are the very last ones to adopt. They're heavily influenced not just by the late majority, not just by observability, because obviously you've been seeing this innovation all over the place for a long time, but by the fact that there's no way to buy the old product. So now it's really an anomaly. So now, like when you go into a Verizon store and you've got all these smartphones and you've got a flip phone. So it's the only one there. There's only two models. They're not any less expensive than the smartphone. And it's starting to be like, okay, so I might as well get a good phone. So we're now going to talk a little bit about the individual characteristics of these different adopters. Innovators are considered venturesome or adventurous, right? They have a very they're very comfortable with risk. They're happy to try something out. And again, all of these things are relative and subjective because typically a new innovation is aimed at non-consumers. So I might be very adventurous when it comes to electric cars because I have an electric car. I'm happy to try it out. I'm really enamored with technology. I spent 30 years in the technology business, and so I'm very comfortable with software. I trust Tesla, engineers. So I'm very comfortable in this space. A different type of innovation might be something I'm uncomfortable with. So everybody has their comfort levels in different types of innovations. So, so innovators will typically try things sooner, but not necessarily everything. Um, Innovators are also seeing, because when people say you're innovative, it kind of seems like a compliment. But in this particular Everett Rogers reading, innovators are looked at kind of crazy with the rest of the population or the community. So I'll give you an example. So an electric car, I've owned an electric car for 4 years. I've influenced absolutely zero people. Actually, no, that's not true. My son owns an electric vehicle because he loved my Tesla, because he was able to observe it, he was able to try it out. He's very adventurous as well. He is very comfortable with risk. But I have a Tesla. My brother-in-law also has a Tesla. So Max was able to really observe a lot and listen to us talking about this. So he became very comfortable with it. But he's the only one I've influenced. So I've got a whole bunch of like girlfriends and family that don't own electric vehicles because they do think that I am way too comfortable with risk, and they are not. So that is something that is important to understand with innovators, because I think of innovators in a positive way, but this characteristic, these categories, it's not necessarily positive. The only people that like innovators are early adopters. So early adopters are a very respectable, conservative part of the community. So when an innovator adopts something, the early adopter, they tend to be friends with these innovators, and they're able to sort of sift through whether or not this is a risky thing, whether or not they'll be seen as they'll maintain their respectability, like um, 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 reputation, I guess, in the community, and so they're careful about the things that they adopt. But when an early adopter adopts, that is a significant part of the diffusion equation. So we noticed in the chapter 6 that there's all these attributes of innovation. So observability increases significantly when we get to the early adopters, because we now have 15% of the population diffusing. So now we're seeing it more and more. And the early majority, they're considered deliberate, right? They're more conservative than the early adopters, but they're heavily influenced by early adopters. So again, early adopters are respected parts of the community and the population. They have a reputation that's conservative and reasonable, and so the early majority becomes very comfortable once the early adopters adopt. This is an area where like marketing people tend to spend a lot of focus, because they know that once early adopters are complete, we're a reasonable way up that bell curve, and we've got a real chance of getting this to diffuse. The early majority, once they start to adopt, again, we see the top of the bell curve. We're at 50% of adoption, the adoption percentages. And now we've got a lot of observability. We've potentially got a lot of trialability, because the early adopters are sharing their vehicles with, the early majority. The early majority, we've got half of those people have adopted. So now we've got them, in 50% of the households that are going to adopt. So everywhere you look, you've got an electric vehicle, a digital camera, whatever it is that's diffusing. The late majority, they're considered very skeptical. And again, it's part of, they're kind of stubborn. They like the mainstream product. And so they don't want to adopt until it's really kind of inconvenient to have the mainstream product versus the new innovation. But then once the late majority adopts, we're around the end of the bell curve, and we're looking at laggards that are very traditional. Like I said, they don't want to adopt until it's very inconvenient to have the mainstream product. And then they're like, oh my gosh, I might as well have the smartphone. I might as well get the electric car. It's really hard to get an internal combustion engine, etc. So it's each adopter category has its characteristics that make up their willingness to adopt a new diffusion. And the speed, the rate of adoption is all dependent on how quickly these different categories adopt and the characteristics of the innovation, the complexity and trialability and observability and the relative advantage. So when you think about that, and this kind of goes back to the articles that I wrote, EV diffusion in mainstream markets looks at why people in a mainstream market would adopt an EV. And my, perspective on it is they wouldn't. There's no reason for them to do it because there really isn't a huge relative advantage to a mainstream market. But when I wrote these articles, I did a lot of research on where these EVs are being targeted. And BYD, which is a Chinese manufacturer, and they're the ones with the very low end price point for EVs, the Seagull. There's a lot of debate. The average price of a Seagull is $12,000, but we see them going in much, much less, which is very helpful for non-consumers. So in a mainstream market like the US, where we've got tons and tons of options from GM, Ford, Chrysler, Toyota, Honda, we have so many options. There's not a lot of reason to adopt an EV. It's very convenient to have an internal combustion engine. And a lot of the population has the ability to purchase. There's a lot of used cars available, so you can get things at lower prices. Nobody really understands that it's cheaper to have an EV. And one of the biggest issues with EVs in our mainstream US market is the price. They're more expensive. It's more expensive to get an EV, despite the fact that there's less parts. And I don't quite understand why you can't make a cheap EV, from the traditional manufacturers or even Tesla. But Tesla's even saying, yeah, we can't compete with that either. There's no way. So I'm not an expert in, manufacturing of automobiles, and I'm just going to take them at their word. And the Chinese do have a lot of advantages when it comes to EV. They have the precious metals that are part of their natural resources. They have a very low priced workforce that can just, produce vehicles a lot less expensive than, the union shops here. So there are advantages and reasons why they're able to produce them cheaper. But what I see happening, and this is the second article, which was EV global diffusion, is that the BYD and Chery manufacturers are aiming at a population of non-consumers. So one of the articles I read, and I think you have access to it in EV global diffusion, looks at one of the BYD targets for this year. I think it was the summer of 2024. They announced the Seagull in Colombia, and their target was young people in Colombia. And they don't have a lot of money. They're competing with the e-bike as far as, what the current, product that these young people use to get around. So it's a very low end vehicle, very inexpensive. And when you think of the attributes of innovation of an EV with regard to an e-bike, now you're seeing real relative advantage, right? I've got a roof and windows. I might have a heater or an air conditioner. And even if I don't, I can now drive to work or wherever it is I'm going, maybe to school, and I'm not going to get wet when it's raining. It's much safer than an e-bike or walking, because when you think about, some of the complaints, it's not safe, like an internal combustion engine. I don't necessarily think that's true, but even if you give it, it's much safer than walking or taking an e-bike. So those types of things, when you're aiming at that non-consumer marketplace, all those things are much stronger for those types of users. So relative advantage is high. Um, Observability will become higher because as these innovators and early adopters adopt, the young people are going to be able to see these vehicles and they're going to think, okay, maybe I can do that. Maybe I save up my money and maybe I get a little bit of a loan and I can have a small, a small car, a small EV that I can charge at my house using 110, whatever the global equivalent might be of that. And it becomes very convenient and very inexpensive for me to purchase this. And I believe that diffusion is going to happen globally. I believe that the dominant design, which is the vehicle that wins out at the end of at about the 50% mark of diffusion, dominant design is typically chosen where, anybody who's competing with EVs, you're now going to have to standardize on this type of EV because this is the one everybody's buying. And a lot of the other competitors will fall away. So I believe that EVs are probably not going to diffuse in our U.S. market for a long time because there's not a lot of attributes that are positive for this type of mass diffusion. But outside of the US, in communities where we have a lot of non-consumers of internal combustion engines, in places where they can manufacture them still inexpensively, Mexico, South America, Africa, where you've got a lower cost workforce, India, obviously China. I think the diffusion is going to be strong, and eventually they will come to the U.S. And it will significantly impact Toyota and Honda and GM and Ford because they have lots of international markets, and as these electric cars diffuse internationally, that diffusion will impact that mainstream market vehicle. So it just gives you a way to look at these different types of diffusion models, and it feeds into what Christensen said. So Christensen doesn't need to be, I don't need to lecture on the Christensen video because he's, the very best at explaining this from a business perspective. And I'm hoping that the rest of the readings help you to build a foundation for diffusion and innovation and disruption, because that will continue through the rest of the course. So hopefully that helped out, and I think we're basically done with module 1. Bye bye.